organizations that have got 45,001, I would guarantee that you're not doing enough for psychological health and safety because you haven't got the competency yet, because it's been a gap in the world of health and safety, and therefore you need to do 45,003 in order to plug that gap. And
let's say that companies have CSR and ESG goals, right? Would 45,001 suffice to fulfill the S in CSR and to fulfill the S in ESG?
So you couldn't achieve the S in both of those without having 45,003, in my view.
Beware, of these organizations that do not go the UCAS accreditation way, okay? And beware of these organizations that offer these very short certification journeys. Just be careful with them. And hello, my name is César, and I'm the founder and managing director of Dharma Center for Wellbeing, and I would like to welcome you to Re-Engaged at Work, a podcast designed with you in mind to help you improve engagement, retention, and performance through workplace well-being. Now, before we get started, make sure to click on the subscribe button below so you can be the first to benefit from the wisdom, experience, and knowledge of our distinguished guests. And speaking of distinguished guests, we are honored to have Kate Field on today's episode. Kate recently held the position of Global Head of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at the British Standards Institution, known as BSI, and has been recently appointed by BSI as Global Head of Human and Social Sustainability. So, Kate, can you please say hi to our audience before I keep boasting about you?
Well, I was just like, oh, distinguished guest. I was like, oh, who's that? You mean, I'm in that category. I'm very honored. Thank you. Hi to all your listeners. It's great to be here.
All right, Kate. So Kate is an award-winning thought leader, author, and keynote speaker covering all aspects of human and social sustainability. She has over 20 years experience across all sectors, from regulator working for HSE, which is the Health and Safety Executive, the government agency that regulates and enforces health and safety in the UK. She's been a consultant as well, and now she's leading BSI's global strategy for creating human-centric workplaces and communities. Kate has also developed the first global training and certification program for psychological health and safety, and BSI's Prioritizing People model, which is focused on creating a culture of trust. And check this out, this program has reached global audiences of more than 4 billion people. So Mark Zuckerberg, eat your heart out.
Oh, I wish.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in the presence of health and safety royalty. So, welcome to today's episode, Kate.
Thank you. I was just thinking, do I need a crown? It's a bit much.
You already have a crown in our eyes.
Oh, thank you.
So, Kate, I'm so excited about today's session because I think you and I, and this is very clear and very evident, are lovers of the standards approach. We find a lot of businesses, that mean well, and they try to do nice things for their people, and they do the fruit baskets and the yoga teachers and the mental health first aiders and the discounts for groceries and movies and the private health insurance and the EAP programs. And none of that stuff might actually be aligned with even the minimum requirements, of what they need to do to minimize work-related stress, anxiety, depression, and to improve engagement, performance, and retention as well in businesses, right? So, but we need to start tracking back a little bit because it's important for people to understand that this is not new. This legislation and all of these requirements didn't come out or didn't basically come out of the back of COVID. This actually has been around for almost 50 years, right? So can you walk us back to, the first piece of legislation that requires businesses, to put in place, systems, to minimize work-related stress, anxiety, and depression, and to help businesses understand that this is not optional. This is not a project that you can put off to the end of, toward the end of last year because you've got other bits and pieces to, think about, right? So let's track back. Where did all this get started? Okay.
Well, I mean, It's a good question. So I think in reality, the principal piece of legislation that sits in the UK and is regarded worldwide as probably one of the best bits of legislation in terms of health, safety and welfare ever written is the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, which was when that came out. And although that doesn't talk about psychological health and safety specifically, it doesn't talk about any individual hazards specifically. It talks about health, safety and welfare. And it talks about the duty of care that employers need to have towards their employees to keep them physically and mentally safe. I mean, again, it doesn't use that terminology, but from a health and safety point of view, it's always been the physical and the mental. We've had a bias towards the physical, and that's where a lot of all the safety, and that's where a lot of the emphasis has been, but actually included the welfare, and the welfare bit was also always looked at that kind of the mental side of things as well, and the health side of things. So it's always been there, but it's kind of, a lot of people talk about, you know, we shout safety and we whisper health, and the whisper in terms of psychological health is so quiet nobody's heard it, and it's really only, I think, in the last decade, if we're lucky, that that whisper's starting to be heard, and now it's quite a loud whisper, but it's not a shout yet, and we need to make it a shout.
Now, as you're saying, you know, the 1974 Act didn't spell out, you know, psychosocial hazards, right? And I'm glad to see that, for instance, in Australia, the legislation actually does spell it out,
It
right?
does.
I think in Canada, you know, it's a similar kind of situation, and I understand that in the UK, the government believes that they don't need to really spell that because it's already there. When it's, you know, when they say the word health, that should, you know, that includes. I mean, obviously, case law has actually helped, you know, to reinforce the element of psychiatric illness, you know, as they sometimes refer to it. So, do you think that you know, case law is enough, and that the pieces of legislation that we have is enough to seriously enforce this now in businesses?
Honestly, yes, I do. So I mentioned the 1974 Act. Supporting that, from 1999, we had the Management and Health and Safety at Work regulations come in, and they talk about assessing risks to workers, and that's health and safety risks. And it's really that piece of legislation that we look to when we're talking about psychological health and safety, because all organisations should be assessing all risks to health and safety of their workers, and one of those risks is psychological health and safety. So I think the legislation is there, and again, I think a lot of the barrier here is our understanding and knowledge around psychological health and safety. You know, that regulation doesn't talk about all the individual hazards. It doesn't talk about machine hazards. It doesn't talk about falling from height. It doesn't talk about noise, you know, but it's incorporated. The expectation is that if they are risks, they are hazards that are present, you need to assess the risks. And it's the same from the health point of view. So I think we like to forget about it, because psychological health and safety is something that a lot of organisations are still very nervous about, because they think it's about mental health, and that makes there's a lot of stigma and misunderstanding associated with that. So personally, yes, I think the legislation is there. I think it was in Australia to a certain extent, because they mirrored a lot of our legislation on that act that I mentioned, the 1974 Act. A lot of countries around the world did that. You know, that's why I said it's kind of seemed as one of the best in the world. But they've gone that step further to give it a real emphasis and a real extra focus. And you're certainly seeing organisations react differently. But I think the legislation here in the UK is sufficient. I think the challenge that we've had is the regulator there, the health and safety executive, haven't given it the priority maybe that they should have done from an enforcement point of view. There's been lots and lots of guidance over 20 plus 30 nearly decades, 3 decades, sorry. But it hasn't had the enforcement focus. So I think organisations haven't given it the focus, but that's changing. It's now one of the focus areas for the health and safety executive. And they will definitely be coming into organisations asking much tougher questions about what organisations are doing from a psychological health and safety point of view.
And if they don't get the answers that they want in terms of those tougher questions, what are the potential consequences, again, of companies not complying with the minimum requirements of their legal duty of care, Kate?
Okay, so health and safety legislation sits under criminal law, so it's part of criminal legislation. So from the health and safety's point of view, they have a number of enforcement options that they can take. If actually an organisation is well on the journey and can show evidence that they're moving in the right direction and there's not a huge gap between kind of where they are and where they need to be, it might just be verbal or simple written advice. If it's more serious, then they might get an enforcement notice, which is a formal piece of enforcement, and sets out where there's been a breach in the legislation and what action they need to take to close that breach. And then, of course, the final penalty is actually taking an organisation to court and prosecuting under the relevant legislation, in which case, if the organisation is found guilty, then they could be fined, and those fines can be quite significant now.
So, sometimes when I get a chance to speak to MDs and chief execs and leaders across the UK, which I do every week, actually. I do my rounds with them. And it's interesting that when I speak to them about their legal duty of care, the majority of leaders in the room, first of all, did not know that they had a formal responsibility, right? So that's the first hurdle, like, oh, really? Do I have a legal responsibility? Okay. Second is, okay, but what is it that I need to do? And usually what we tell them is, listen, among other things, fire risk management and first aid kit and, all of those basic stuff, you have to have, we call it a mental health and safety management system. The reason why we call it a mental health and safety management system in place is because every time I mention, not every time, but most of the time when I mention the word psychological, I can see the look on their faces and they get a bit of a reaction and they feel that, no, that's not my, that's not my purview. Psychology, no, no, no. But when I say mental health and safety, at least they don't, they don't they don't react to it. And I said, listen, it's fairly straightforward. You have to have a system in place that allows you to identify hazards of a psychosocial nature, which we will define in a moment. And then this system should, once you identify the hazards, you have to assess the frequency, the severity, who's impacted by this. Next step is, once you prioritize, then you have to put the control measures in place to make sure that you minimize or eliminate those risks of a psychosocial nature. And then you have to do a management review, just to check, just to see if if what you're doing is actually working, right? Now, but some businesses say, well, but I already have a traditional occupational health and management system. And actually, I already have ISO 45001. I'm covered. And when I say to them, and correct me that I'm wrong, if I'm wrong, right? So yes, we have hazards of a physical nature, of a chemical nature, of a biological nature, of an ergonomic nature, but the psychosocial hazards, world is completely different. There's a massive difference between spotting a water cooler that's dripping, or cables dangling from the ceiling, or a carpet that has, what do you call it, that you can trip on, compared to, victimization, discrimination, bullying, role ambiguity, leadership incompetence, workload, work pace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the dozens and dozens and dozens of psychosocial hazards, right? So, because of the importance of this, let's help the audience, first of all, understand, what is, a hazard of a psychosocial nature. So from this point forward, we're not going to talk about hazards of a physical, chemical, biological, or economic nature. It's just psychosocial. So let's first define what a psychosocial hazard is, and then let's keep the conversation flowing from that.
I'd actually like to go back before we do that, and just present a different viewpoint, because I think one of the challenges we have is a lot of people think that psychological health and safety, psychosocial hazards, it uses these big words, that they are something completely new, they are something completely different, and therefore you need a deeper level of expertise, that it's not normal health and safety. I actually believe that they're easier to manage, identify and manage than a lot of traditional health and safety risks. So actually for me, you know, when we look at traditional safety hazards, quite often you've got to have training and understanding to understand what those hazards are. You've got to understand where to find them. You've got to understand the implications of them. And then you've got to understand what the controls are. That doesn't happen by magic. We're not all born with this knowledge. You know, you introduced me, and I and I was an inspector for a number of years. I went through a 2-year training program to understand health and safety hazards and risk within an organization, and it was all aspects of that. And psychological health and safety is just the same. We need to break down the barriers for organizations to do this. If they've got a health and safety management system, that's fantastic, because they've got, I would say, probably 70, 80% of the skills and the knowledge that they need to manage psychological health and safety. They just need to understand and what this particular type of hazard is, and where to find it, and what to do about it. And because it's about people, and most of us have experienced these hazards, and we'll start to go through some of them, I actually think it's much easier. A lot of people might not have experienced a machinery safety hazard, or a vibration hazard, or a work at height hazard, or being exposed to asbestos in the workplace. They might not understand the implication of long-term exposure to excessive noise and the implications that has. But a lot of us will be able to understand exactly the impact that bullying has. So I actually think, you know, for me, it's probably the easiest of all of our health and safety hazards to tackle and look at. We just need to break down the barriers.
Yeah, and breaking down the barriers in our world, you know, in the work that we do, is raising awareness and educating both employees and people managers on what those hazards are.
Mm.
Like, for instance, right, when it comes to discrimination, a lot of people do not really understand, you know, what the full scope of what discrimination is about. You know, they might not know that there's something known as indirect discrimination. You know, when basic, for instance, right, let's say that a company and issues a policy that every single employee, you know, should come to work at 9 a.m.
Mm.
Let's go Elon Musk here. No? Everyone should be at work at 9 a.m. Right?
I think he'd
And
probably want everybody there at 4 a.m. and
yeah,
back
exactly.
around till 2 a.m.
So, and let's say that there's people, both men and women, okay, that might have caregiving responsibilities, and they cannot be there at 9 a.m. They can only be there at 9:45. So they're being indirectly discriminated against, because obviously, you know, the policy is for everyone, okay, but they're being indirectly discriminated, and they actually have a case. So once they're educated on the fact that this is indirect discrimination, when they receive our workplace stressor survey, you know, every quarter, then they'll be able to say, hey, I'm being discriminated against, and they can report it, you know, and that basically hazard can, you know, can make it to the risk register now because it's been reported. Or associated discrimination as well. I mean, and bullying, you mentioned bullying, right? I mean, there's so many behaviors that constitute bullying. And bullying can be covert, and it could be indirect as well. So for instance, let's say that you know, you and I are working together, and I decide to withhold information from you so that you can do your work. I haven't said a single word to you. I haven't even approached you physically, and I'm bullying you based on current, you know, definition of bullying. So, and again, a number of behaviors that sometimes, you know, people, you know, something very typical in England, banter. You know, banter is something that we obviously enjoy, but banter has to be lighthearted. It has to be mutual, right? But there's a fine line between banter and bullying as well, and even harassment, right?
Mm.
And it's interesting because we had an employment lawyer in one of our episodes a few weeks ago, and he said that, let's say that you and I are in a meeting, okay, and one of our colleagues makes a joke, okay, to another colleague about, for instance, a menopause symptom. Oh yeah, you cannot think clearly because you've got, foggy brain, okay, and you, who were not the recipient of this comment, you felt impacted by this. You can actually raise a claim for bullying in the workplace, even without you having been part of that conversation. So it's important for people to understand the whole breadth, of these hazards and all of the different nuances and iterations in order for them to be identified properly, right? So yes, I totally agree with you in terms of lowering the barriers and training people to identify these hazards in the first place.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, again, before we get onto the detail of this, I think it's worth just clarifying, particularly when we're talking about things like discrimination, bullying and harassment. There's another piece of legislation that's very relevant that I didn't talk about here, which is the Equality Act. I'm not such an expert on the Equality Act, and I can't remember off the top of my head whether it is criminal or civil legislation. I want to say it's civil, but don't hold me to that.
It's civil. It's
It is
civil.
civil,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's important to understand there's quite a big difference between criminal legislation, which I talked about, which is things like the Health and Safety at Work Act, which I talked about, the management regulations that I talked about, and civil litigation. The evidence that you need to show is very, very different. The duty of care that comes into play is very, very different. And therefore, for things like discrimination, for bullying, harassment, they often come through the civil legislation side of things. And that is different to the criminal side of things. And there is other legislation, things like the Equality Act being the principal one, but also things like employment, terms of conditions around employment would fall into that. So again, there is a piece here that organisations need to understand the wider landscape. We started with a very specific health and safety legislation landscape, but actually when we're talking about psychological health and safety, it crosses over into both these landscapes. And I think that is something that is really important for organisations to understand. And again, I think one of the reasons why organisations have sometimes failed to go on the full journey, because what it needs is your health and safety team to work together with your HR team, because it really crosses these two boundaries. And a lot of organizations don't understand that. They have the health and safety team doing traditional health and safety, they have HR doing equality, employment law, those sorts of things, and then you have this big gap in the middle around psychological health and safety, but it needs those teams to come in together to fill that gap.
Speaking of traditional health and safety, so when ISO 45001 came out in 2018, I immediately looked at it, and I can tell you my heart sank. It's like, I know that this was an upgrade from, OSA's 18001, and we'll talk about that. But, because it was an upgrade and because it was a global standard, I said, okay, yes, they're going to cover psychosocial hazards. And I looked at it, and I was just flipping through the pages, and I actually thought that I printed the document incorrectly, and I didn't print the pages of that pertain to psychosocial hazards. And then I realized that they were really not included. And it's like, really, ISO had the chance to really tackle this, and they just came up with a traditional occupational health and safety management system. And then I started talking to people, and I was told that, listen, actually, they're working on a child standard, which is 45,003, which will be, focused primarily on psychosocial health and safety. And that gave me, some hope. And then, of course, when it came out in 2021, 45,003, I said, okay, now we're talking, right? I was still fairly disappointed that it wasn't, a parent standard like it should. And I understand the whole idea of, I mean, I've been trying, I've been, what do you call it? I don't know. Let's just say that I was a bit disappointed that it was not made a parent standard, but at least it's a really good set of guidelines, and it's a good framework that will allow businesses to actually place the necessary focus. So, um, what is your message, Kate, to those businesses that have already gone the ISO 45001 route and are debating, are on the fence, whether to go for, 45003, certification. And then we'll talk about certification accreditation and what that means, later on. But I do want to say certification for 45003. Although it's not UCAS accredited, but we'll talk about that later on. What's your message to, again, companies that already have 45001 and that feel comfortable with that and don't think that they should actually take that 25% extra step that you were mentioning to get certified in 45003? What's your message to them?
So again, I suppose I want to take a step back before I answer the question specifically. I might do that a lot. So I think it's important to understand that ISO 45001 is the international management system for health and safety management. It's the overarching framework. And it's a great framework. It's really robust. It's one of the most comprehensive of all there's frameworks, these management frameworks for a lot of health, for a lot of corporate risk. So for quality, for environmental, for business continuity, and this one's particularly for health and safety risk. And actually, it does include psychosocial hazards. If you look, it doesn't use that term. And actually, it's quite unusual because it does, again, like the legislation I said, doesn't list all of the different individual hazards and risks. But actually, 45001 does talk about and explicitly mention
Workload,
it talks about workload, it talks about working
workplace.
hours, it talks about culture, and it talks about leadership. The big four, if you like, or it might be five, I've got it in front of me. It talks about and explicitly mentions those. And it doesn't do that for any other hazards. I think the challenge is, and it's the same as with the legislation, is there isn't the knowledge and the understanding and the competency yet within organizations to make sure that organizations are tackling those risks. And I think, in the same way, and the Australia example is a good example maybe here, in the same way that they had legislation that did cover health, psychological health and safety, but they recognized that organizations weren't doing enough, they weren't upgrading their competency to really tackle it. It's the same from a standards point of view. If an organization had the understanding, the competency around psychological health and safety, they could incorporate it into 45001. It's designed to do that. It's designed to cover all health and safety risks. The gap is that competency, and therefore the committee that wrote 45001, this overarching standard, wanted to help organizations plug that gap. So they wrote 45003, which is a guidance standard explicitly looking at psychological health and safety. So to answer your question, for organizations that have got 45001, I would guarantee that you're not doing enough for psychological health and safety because you haven't got the competency yet, because it's been a gap in the world of health and safety, and therefore you need to do 45003 in order to plug that gap. And there's legal requirements that that underpin this. And it is, again, I want to emphasize that there is this fear. It does feel like this big gap. It does feel something that's complicated, but actually it's really accessible. It's not a huge leap. It's not like you need to completely change everything that you're doing. There are some really hard and really tough questions. I mentioned that in 45001, the overarching standard, it talks about culture and leadership. They are at the heart of psychological health and safety, and they are big and potentially difficult areas to tackle, but there's lots of things underneath that you can do in a much more accessible way.
Hey, I think the message is loud and clear, right? If you've got 45001, it's not complete. Your journey has not been
No,
completed just
exactly.
yet. You're Frodo in the second movie. You still you still I don't remember the names of the movies now, but you
Look.
haven't gotten to the ring just yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
Now,
I mean, I think that's right. And I think, you know, the thing is as well is that, you know, you're really missing an opportunity to not just create the best workplace for your workers, but you are missing the opportunity to create the best business and the most successful business. Because if you get psychological health and safety right and you address these issues, you know, you can go from being a good organization to a great organization because you're creating the right culture, the right environment for your people to flourish. And that means that they'll go the extra mile, you'll get innovation. And it's hugely powerful. And I think that's one of the things that we need to make sure organizations understand.
and it's interesting, Kate, because I've had to change the way I present this to the leaders that I get to speak with. In the past, I used to when I did my leadership sessions, I would go through the exercise of, okay, write down 3 adjectives that you would like your best friend to utilize to describe you, or if your best friend were to be delivering a eulogy. Let's say you check out of this world and your best friend is talking about you. What are the 3 adjectives that you would like your friend to use, you know, that would basically describe your leadership style? And the number one, and this is across the world, not just the UK, in Europe, North America, is caring. There was elements of fairness and trustworthy, but the number one was caring. And this goes hand in hand with, you know, this typical statement that most leaders utter, which I think it's the most hypocritical statement ever. People are our greatest asset, right? And so you hear people say that. You hear people say, I want to be seen as caring, you know, and then when you present them with okay, these are your options: legal duty of care, achieve national standards of workplace well-being, or achieve international standards of workplace well-being, they still, it's very hard for them to make the connection between employee well-being and performance, engagement, and retention. And you show them the studies, and it's like, I'm not saying all of them are that, you know, all of them are like that, but there's a significant number that still do not see the value, you know, do not see the concrete value in those KPIs that you've mentioned, right?
Mhm.
And those companies that do see the value are actually now benefit, you know, from it, because obviously they get to hire the best talent, they have higher valuations,
Mhm.
you know, they have increased performance, increased
Mhm.
earnings, and studies are now supporting this, right?
Mhm.
So that's why it's very unfortunate that you and I needed to start talking about the legal aspects of this instead of the moral or the ethical or the cultural, you know, or the human element of this. Speaking of which, I have another question for you, Kate. So let's say that uh, companies have CSR and ESG goals, right?
Mhm.
Would 45,001 suffice to fulfill the S in CSR and to fulfill the S in ESG, the social element?
45,001, 45,003 are a
No,
really important parts. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, 45,003. So you couldn't achieve the S in both of those without having 45,003, in my view. When we're talking about the S, it goes further than just psychological health and safety. But I think that the thing to understand is the S in both of those is around the culture of the organization. And you cannot create a authentic culture of care and trust if you haven't addressed psychological health and safety. So whatever else you might be doing, and if we're talking about the S, you know, there might be initiatives around modern slavery, there might be initiatives around diversity and inclusion, there might be initiatives around volunteering and community impact, all great things, and some of those cross over into psychological health and safety, like equity, diversity, inclusion. You know, it's a big area where we see discrimination. So it can be making some steps, but unless you are addressing psychological health and safety, honestly, you're not even going to be close.
yeah. All right. That's another clear message as well, Kate. And it's interesting because I think I shared with you the certification rates of ISO standards around the world, and I was doing the math, right? And I think it was in the late 1980s that ISO 9001, came about. And now it's obviously, this is a quality management for those listeners who are not familiar with the ISO standards. And now it's 2024. Okay, and it's taken 30 plus years for 9001 to actually get to 1.1 million businesses certified, right? Which is a pretty good achievement. What's interesting is that 45,001, which is the traditional occupational health and safety management standard, it took them only 4 years to get to 350,000, certifications. So it's tripled the growth rate, that yearly growth rate of 9001. And if you couple that, I mean, I know that ISO will not report 45,003 numbers, but I'm pretty sure that the attach ratio is significant, 45,001 to 45,003. Based on the math, in 10 years' time, 45,001 plus 45,003 could actually be the #1 ISO standard in history. Yeah. If the rate of certification continues like this, right? So for those businesses that want to keep on giving movie discounts and gym memberships and discounts for groceries and cycle to work schemes, and they think they're doing great, I think they're gonna miss a massive trend. The world is going in that direction. The world is going in the direction of standards, right? And the beauty of standards is that, I mean, from my point of view, and I want to hear your point of view as well, Kate, is that it's the roadmap to efficiency. It's a framework that allows you to make sure that you are maximizing your return on investment on any kind of investment that you want to do in employee well-being, right? A lot of businesses are now shooting in the dark just because they have emotional bonding sessions, on the weekend, or just because they bring inspirational speakers. Those are investments, but are they actually giving you the ROI? Are they minimizing the work-related stress, anxiety, and depression? So what's your view then on the world of standards? Why would you recommend for businesses to, again, either just follow a legal duty of care, standard /framework, or national standards of workplace well-being, or international standards of workplace well-being, in this case, ISO? What would you recommend businesses to go the standards route?
Okay, so it might be worth giving a little bit of context about standards. So I won't do a full history lesson. But standards are written by industry and experts to meet industry need. So, and international standards are made up of an international community. So you get experts coming together who basically analyze and bring all of their knowledge and expertise to understand what is needed in a particular risk area, and bearing in mind sector need and knowledge as well, and to create a best practice framework. It's like free consultancy. A standard is free consultancy. It gives you the framework of what you need to do to be best in class. So why wouldn't you use it? And that's what they're designed to do. And in some parts of the world, you have, they're not necessarily directly linked, but Europe do this a lot. They have the legislation, and then they'll be looking for standards to fill in the detail of what's needed. So the legislation will say you must do this, but then the standard will say this is how you do it, this is what you need to think about, this is what you need to do. And that's what standards are there for. And that's for 45,003, that's a really great example. So here in the UK, I've said that the management system regulations require that you have a management system, that you do risk assessments, that you identify the controls. 45,003 gives you a best practice framework about how to do that. So they're designed to help organizations to understand what they need to do, to understand what good looks like, to help them on that journey, and most importantly, to help them then continually improve. These things are never static. Any business risk is never static. You know, there are all sorts of things that change over time, and therefore you need to change over time, and a standard allows you to do that.
Speaking of standards, and I think we need to clarify this as well, some people mistake certain certifications for standards, right? So for instance, companies like Great Place to Work, Investors in People, Best Companies, these companies are not standard bodies, right? These companies are certification organizations that primarily focus on engagement and primarily focus on culture, but do not really do, a deep dive in the world of mental health and safety, right? And it's interesting because we've worked with clients that actually have achieved, some of the highest levels, with these organizations, Great Place to Work, Investors in People, Best Companies, and they are not even meeting their legal duty of care. All right. And it's hard for them to understand. We've got clients that actually are B Corp certified, and we've done a legal duty of care assessment, and they do not meet their legal duty of care, even though they've got, B Corp certification, right? So, and when people ask me, hey, is it worth it, to get Great Place to Work certification, Investors in People, Best Companies, B Corp? I say, absolutely. It's absolutely worth it because it's helping you, shift your mindset, toward an employee-oriented, kind of approach. So it's great because these certification, not, these are certification, what do you call it, organizations, not standard bodies. They give you, like you were saying, they force you to ask these questions. They do culture audits, and they want to really understand, the employee journey from when you interview someone and until you exit someone. How do you manage that? And that's great. And I say to them, yes. If you want to pursue those certifications, absolutely, I think it'll help. But you have to start with your legal duty of care, and then you have to, and then of course, as you were saying, go the ISO standard route, because it'll guarantee you that you are doing the mental health and safety element in the best way possible, right? So what is your particular view, of these or very well-known organizations, and how do they compare to, ISO standards?
So they come from a different place, and are designed in a different way. Quite often they're focused on a specific area. So Investors in People, I'll simplify it a little bit, but it's about learning and development. Whereas standards are looking at kind of the overarching risk profile. So it's a plan, do, check, act. So it's very much a process-driven approach. And they have to be written in a certain way. There's a whole kind of governance around the development of standards, international standards, and also then the way that they're used. So there's a governance that's associated with standards, and I'm sure we'll come on to this when we talk about certification as well. There's a set of rules that have to be used and followed for organizations, although they're voluntary. For these other processes, they don't have that. They over time they will create their own approach because they want to ensure consistency and quality, but there isn't the overarching governance that comes with them as well. And again, I think one of the things that I've seen, and I suppose this starts to bring us into a wider topic discussion about well-being as opposed to just psychological health and safety. The key challenge is and one of the reasons, there's two reasons why organizations really fail to address employee well-being, and I think there's a whole piece around how you define that, and most organizations don't and aren't even close. But the two reasons why organizations really fail in this is, first and foremost, is because they haven't addressed psychological health and safety. And secondly, is because they're not looking at these issues holistically. They're looking at them in isolation. So you'll have somebody doing Investors in People looking at learning and development, and you might have somebody doing Time for Change. That's a really interesting one, because that's about mental health, but it's not about psychological health and safety in the workplace. So you have these two initiatives, they're people focused, they have some good stuff, they can make improvements, but because they're not working together, and they're not looking at psychological health and safety, they're limited. They always have limited impact, and we see it. And you talked about return on investment. Organizations do want to generally invest in their people, not their assets. I really hate that. The building is an asset, the heating system is the asset, the laptop is an asset. People are human beings, we're not assets. Organizations recognize that to get the best out of their people, and therefore the best out of their organization, they need to do things positively for their people, but they don't understand the right things, and it tends to be badge collecting, if I'm honest. And a lot of these initiatives and activities are papering over the cracks, or putting a sticking plaster over bigger issues around culture, around workloads, around resourcing, around bullying, around poor leadership styles. And unless the organizations tackle those cracks are always going to be there. They're on there, get bigger. So that's the challenge. If organizations looked at those initiatives as part of a holistic approach with psychological health and safety, then that's great. And some of that will also help their organizations with their psychological health and safety journey. One of the social risks is around career development. People want to feel that they have the opportunity to grow and develop. So if you've got investors in people, and you've got a kind of an L&D program, actually that's really great. That's an element of psychosocial risk that you're already tackling, but you might not have made that link, and you might not be, there might be a few bits you need to do there, plus other stuff in other areas. But that's the piece. It's how do you look at these things holistically? How do you bring it all together? How do you make sure that you're not missing the big things that are legally required, as well as the nice to haves?
Yeah, especially talking about the legal requirements, yes. So I told you that a couple of days ago I went to the Health and Wellbeing at Work event in Birmingham, and investors and people had a huge stand, and they had a massive sign that said our newly developed workplace wellbeing framework. And I said, oh, fantastic. They've revamped, what they already had. Let me check it out. So I went to talk to them. And by the way, I'm not putting down investors and people. I'm just pointing something out, right? So I went to speak to them and said, listen, let me see your framework. I mean, you are actually certifying, businesses for investing in employee well-being, and the certification lasts 3 years. And so I have a question for you. Can someone actually obtain the highest ranking in this particular category if they don't have a mental health and safety management system in place? And they looked at me as if they didn't understand the question, right? So I said, okay, do you know that Regulation 3 of the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations of 1999 actually requires businesses to conduct risk assessments, and Regulation 5, requires businesses to take preventative and proactive measures based, do you actually evaluate businesses, on these legal requirements? And she said, what legal requirements again? So it's like, we are giving these businesses all of these massive awards, and, telling the world that they invest in people when they're not even doing the basic things right. So, and again, as you were saying, these organizations primarily assure learning and development and culture and engagement, and we cannot forget the missing piece, the psychological health and safety, which brings me to the point of, okay, let's say that a business says, okay, Kate, you've convinced me. My 45,001 is not enough, or I haven't got a standard. I'm going to go for 45,001, or perhaps I just want to go for 45,003 and then complement it with 45,001. So, and I love that you like to track back when I ask questions. So feel free to track back if need be. But if a business makes that conscious decision, okay, I want to meet international standards of mental health and safety or psychological health and safety, what's the first step that they need to take?
So, firstly, I'd say huge congratulations. That means that you're world leading. in your approach to your people. If you're recognizing that you want to go on the journey towards implementing 45,003, it should be emphasized that standards 45,001 or 45,003, they are voluntary, but what they do is demonstrate how you are helping conform to the legislation, you know, in a particular area. So there is a link. They're not required by law, but if you've got them in place, when the HSE, the regulator, comes knocking and you say, well, this is what I'm doing, they'll go, fantastic, you're well on that journey. So they're really important. The first step, as with any of these things, is to understand where you are and where you need to get to. So you might call it a gap assessment, a gap analysis. That's your first step, because as I've mentioned, you're probably doing more than you think you are. If you've got 45,001, you'll already be doing a lot. If you've got if you're doing some of these other initiatives, you know, investors in people, you're probably doing some really great stuff. If you've got some other stuff under your well-being, and I do bunny ears here, well-being, things like investors in people, employee assistance programs, you know, maybe what you're doing from an occupational health point of view around sickness absence, all of those will be part of the picture from a psychological health and safety point of view. So starting to do that mapping, understand what you've got, and then you can identify where your gaps are, and then you can look at those gaps and go, okay, how do we prioritize? You know, what do we need to do to fill those gaps? So that would be the starting point.
Okay. And would you recommend?
And I suppose I suppose there's a piece here, and because I mentioned it before, is about understanding your competency in this space. So, you know, you know, have you got people who are sufficiently competent in terms of psychological health and safety? And I think on this point, it's really, really important to say that, because we talk about psychological health and safety and psychosocial risks, you don't need to be a doctor in psychology. You know, your health and safety professional can do a lot of this. They just need to have that upskilling on this particular hazard. And again, as I've said, a lot of these are things that as human beings in the workplace we've experienced, and I think that makes it more accessible, but you will need to consider the competency in order to go on this journey.
And would you recommend businesses as well to get help from their friendly workplace, ISO 45003 workplace wellbeing consultancy?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so it's interesting. We talked about the regulation, the management of health and safety at work regulation, and that regulation actually explicitly has a regulation around ensuring that you have competency. And if you don't have that competency in-house, then you need to get that competency externally. So, you know, you have to have the competency, and then for your business, it's about how best to fulfill that. You know, whether you've got it internally, whether you upskill, or whether you reach out to your friendly ISO 45003 consultancy to help you on that journey.
Allow me to explain Kate's cheeky smile. So there's only a handful of ISO 45003 consultants in the UK, and BSI has honored us by allowing us to be an associate consultant for BSI when it comes to the implementation of 45003. And Kate, you've been a massive supporter of us as well, and we are deeply grateful for that.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I'm passionate about this because not only is it the right thing to do for people, it's the right thing to do for business. And, you know, there is still this skills gap. You know, there are a lot of, unfortunately, in the world of wellbeing, there are a lot of snake oil salespeople, and that's drifting over into this field of psychological health and safety as well. You know, there are a lot of people who will start to talk about this standard 45,003, talk about psychological health and safety or mental health, and not really understand what it means from a work point of view, from a workplace health and safety point of view, and it does sit under health and safety. And therefore, we've got to champion the organisations and the people who are leading, and signposts so that organisations can get that help. So, we have a very rigorous process in terms of assuring that anybody that we have an agreement with as an associate consultant, they have to go through a rigorous procedure before we do that. We don't let anybody do it. So it's great that you're in a position to help organizations on this journey.
Thank you, Kate. And again, we're honored and we're going to make you proud, as I said to you earlier as well. Now, speaking of snake oil, right? I am very concerned about the number of businesses out there that promise, businesses to get them certified, in standards like 45,001 and 45,003 in 60 to 90 days, right? And I'm going like, so my first reaction was like, are they magicians? And then my second reaction was, they're scammers, right? I mean, that was the only thing. I mean, because I know the amount of work that goes into setting up a business, to be able to be certification ready. So, what are the telltale signs that a consultancy, or let's have two separate conversations. First of all, consultancies that say that they can actually help you out, and then they can actually help you out in a very short period of time. What are the telltale signs, that these companies are bogus? And then what are the let's talk about certification organizations in a few months. Let's start first with those businesses that say that they can help you out in a very short period of time.
I think any organization that puts a time frame on achieving a certification is an alarm bell, because it's impossible to tell until you start the journey and you've done that gap assessment. So, for some organizations, they might already have 90% of what they need, in which case, they might get it actually within a few months. But you can't say that before you've started, and for a lot of organizations they'll need more. So I think if that's an immediate warning sign to me, is any organization that is marketing that they can get you a certificate in X many days. I mean, they might have some terms and conditions associated with that, but that's an alarm bell to me. That's setting an expectation that is just not realistic.
Okay, and then of course, let's now talk about certification, right? So let's say that, a company is now, 45,003 ready, to be certified. And can you just, explain to our audience, what's the difference between certification in 45,001 and 45,003, the whole UCAS, element to it, and because businesses still want their badge, right? And I know that BSI still gives out a 45,003 badge, but there are certain things that need to be clarified, just for transparency.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just to reiterate, certification is a voluntary requirement. And the reason a lot of organizations want the certification is the certification is an independent review about how good you are against that standard. And that carries a lot of weight, because I think sometimes, you can implement something internally, but you can become blind to how effective or not effective it is. And a certification gives you that independent assurance by somebody expert coming in on a regular basis to make sure everything's still working as it is, and that you are continuing to drive improvement. So, there are huge benefits to certification, which is why so many hundreds of thousands of organizations around the world go on that journey. There is, and this is where it gets a bit nerdy, so bear with us, listeners, while I talk you through this. In the world of international standards, in order to ensure the credibility and the robustness of those standards, so I said that we get international experts coming together to write best practice, and that's what standards are. We want to ensure that that best practice is implemented properly in organizations. So around the framework for implementing and doing certification, there is a very robust and rigorous process that certification bodies have to go through in order to demonstrate that they have the expertise to go in as an independent body and audit these standards and give a certificate. It's very robust. It's very, you know, we get audited. So in the same way, a certification that we do for one of these standards, you know, we will come in, we will do an initial assessment, we'll say whether you meet the standard, then we will come in on a regular basis to make sure that you're maintaining that. Certification bodies have to do that where they're accredited, and this is the important differentiation, is that in order to deliver certain types of standards, so we talked about 45001 as the overarching, or I tend to talk about it as the parent child. In order to be a certification body, so to give us to be a company that can come in and do an independent audit and then give a certification, you have to be accredited, and you have to be accredited to an accreditation body. So in the UK, that's UCAS, and UCAS are the overarching body that's auditing the certification bodies to make sure they're doing their job properly and that we are maintaining the integrity of those standards. So it's this layer. So we have standards that are best practice in order to make sure that they are being implemented properly. There's certification bodies who come in and do an independent audit, but to make sure that those certification bodies are doing a good job, we have an accreditation body. So it's important to understand that relationship. Now, the complexity comes that there are certain other standards, so things like a 45003, a child standard, where you don't need to be in accreditation. You don't need to have that link through to an accreditation body. But that means that you can go in, you can audit, you can give a certificate, but there's no robustness about the integrity of that process for that organization. And one of the things that, you know, organizations I think need to do, we use this term in health and safety quite a lot, although maybe a lot of people aren't aware of it, is about being an intelligent customer. So, you know, it's not just about choosing a partner to work with who's got the shiniest badges or says the right things. Actually, what's the integrity behind that? What's the quality behind that? And certification bodies that are accredited, like BSI, we have that integrity, we have that quality. If you use a certification body that isn't accredited, you don't have the same level of confidence at all, because there's no process that backs that up.
So, okay, we've got UCAS, but then of course we've got this this other accreditation body, ASCB, Accreditation Service Certifying Bodies, right? So what's the difference between UCAS and ASCB, which, I mean, they present themselves as the equivalent to a certain extent to UCAS, or what's the main difference between the two of them?
I have to be honest, I've never heard of them, which probably says it all, to
Okay.
be honest. You know, there are accreditation bodies. They are, again, they have to be members of, there's an overarching accreditation forum, an international accreditation forum. Accreditation bodies have to be part of that forum. I've never heard of them.
Okay.
I'm aware of all the major ones. So they're either brand new and they haven't made the list, or they're potentially not quite what they see. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd have to investigate that.
Well, what's interesting is that there are certification,
Mhm.
quote unquote, organizations out there that interestingly, you know, they offer you this, we'll certify you in 60 days and 90 days. And even though our certification body is non-UCAS accredited, we are accredited by this entity called ASCB. So it's like they're trying to create that additional layer outside of the most, you know, the most robust and the most or that additional layer of integrity that the UCAS brings, right? So just for our listeners and for our viewers, just beware, you know,
Mm.
of these organizations that do not go the UCAS accreditation way. Okay, and beware of these organizations that offer these very short certification journeys. Just be careful with them. And if you have any questions, about any of them, you can reach out to Kate, and you can reach out to myself, and our details are in the description of this video. Okay. All right, Kate. So, can you talk to us about BSI and the role of BSI in general, not just in connection with 45,001 and 3, but just in general, because BSI is a massive global organization with a massive number of programs and initiatives. So what are you guys about?
Thank you. We're about making the world a better place. That's how I like to summarize it, which is a really amazing place to be. So I avoided the history lesson, but now you've given me the opportunity to give it. So BSI, British Standards Institution, is where the world of standards comes from. So back in, I think it was 1901, when the Industrial Revolution hit and trams were becoming very popular, there was a challenge because there were different tram tracks being developed, which meant that different cities had different distances between their trams, which means that the tram lorry carts that were being used, carriages, were different, which meant you couldn't move them. So it was chaos. In simple terms, everybody wanted to use this new technology, but it was chaos because there was no standard. So the first standard was written. So BSI is basically the creator of standards, and we were then a founding member of the international standards. As the power of standards became to be understood around the world, there was a desire to create an international forum so that we could have international standards to enable consistency globally, world trade. So we're a founding member. And really, we have two bits of the business. So every country now has a national standards body. Basically every country in the world does have or can have a national standards body. And they are the body that is often helping and supporting government to develop standards to help an individual's country grow, and then working with either European or international level to develop those international standards. So we're the national standards body is the body that brings together the experts to write the best practice and then publish them. So that's one part of BSI in its heart, and we do amazing work. We generally do world leading. So we were the first, it was BSI that created the first standard on health and safety management, back in 1986. We've just launched a new standard on menstruation and menopause in the workplace. We genuinely push the boundaries in terms of expectations around people at work and making the workplace a better place. And now we cover all subjects. I mean, I've talked. I think there's probably a standard on almost anything you can think about. Apparently, there is actually a standard on making a cup of tea, as we're British. But seriously, they're about they're about business risk. So we talked about quality, environmental, energy management, business continuity, cybersecurity, data protection. All of those big corporate risks. There's standards. And then the other side of the business in BSI is really the commercial side. So we have the bit of the business that develops and publishes standards, and then the commercial side, which is really helping organizations implement those standards. So offering training, offering gap assessments, offering a range of audits, so internal audit, external audits, certification, which we've talked about, so that independent third-party assurance. And we do that, as I say, against a huge range of areas, and some of that is where it's business systems, it's a lot of it's voluntary, but we also do a lot in product certification, which is often supported under regulatory requirements. So things like medical devices, things like personal protective equipment, fire safety equipment. We do all the testing and certification for those. So where they have depending where you are in the world, a UKCA mark or a CE mark, we do the testing for that. So, we are genuinely making the world a better place through all of those activities.
Oh, Kate, I could be here talking to you. I can go Joe Rogan on you and stay 3 or 4 hours, talking to you. But I want to be very respectful of your time. And before we leave, I want to put you on the spot, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, which are questions that I usually ask of my guests in this podcast. Can you think of 1 or 2 heroes, past or present, that have had the most influence in you professionally or personally?
Oh, there's so many. Who would, and it depends on what moment in what in what moment in time. There was a line manager that I had when I was in HSE, who taught me some really great lessons about just how to be and how to be around other people, and that stayed with me. So yeah, so there's definitely a line manager there, and I think every single person out there who is looking to make the workplace a better place for people, every single one of those is my hero, because it takes all of us. It takes effort. It's not always easy. We have to be resilient. So every single person that's trying to make the workplace a better place is my hero.
All right, great answer. And the final question, please complete the following sentence. The world would be a better place if...
Every organization implemented 45,003.
Music to my ears, Kate. Kate, I cannot begin to, thank you enough, for your generosity, for your time, for your wisdom, for your insights, for your experience. I think our viewers and listeners are going to get a lot out of this. And I'm pretty sure that they'll feel inspired and motivated, to go the standards route, to really, really make the world a better place through their businesses, and they can enjoy the benefits of that through increased market share, profitability, engagement, retention, and all of that good stuff that we talked about. So, Kate, thank you so much, for your time, and hopefully there'll be a part 2 of this podcast down the line.
Maybe. It's been my pleasure. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thank you, Kate.